Her meals grew simpler: a slice of toast, a cup of tea, sometimes a bowl of soup she barely finished. The food grew cold quickly. She rarely had the energy to warm it again. The apartment felt larger than before. The quiet settled into every corner, heavy, like a thick blanket she couldn't shake off. Margaret tried calling once. The phone rang several times before voicemail answered. She hung up without leaving a message. Her voice felt small. She didn't want to beg. The days blurred into each other. She marked them softly on her calendar, one red X after another, as if trying to prove to herself that time was still moving. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon became night. She read old books, but her mind wandered. She knitted scarves that piled up in a neat stack, unworn and unneeded. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The clock ticked steadily, filling the silence. She heard the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint creaks of the old pipes, the wind tapping gently against the windows. No voices, no laughter, no one knocking at the door. Her world had grown so small that even the smallest sounds seemed loud now. The clink of her spoon against the teacup, the soft shuffle of her slippers on the floor, the quiet sighs she didn't mean to make. The loneliness sat beside her like a shadow. But in that heavy stillness, she began to hear something else. Herself. Her own breath. Her own steady heartbeat. The quiet strength that had always carried her, even when others couldn't see it. For so long, she had filled her days with others. Caring for David, comforting Susan, raising the grandchildren, holding the family together. She had given everything, asking for so little. And now, when she needed them most, they had vanished. Margaret sat by the window as evening fell, the last bits of light fading into darkness. She held her warm cup of tea close and whispered softly to herself, "I'm still here." Her voice was quiet but steady. She was alone, but she was listening. And for the first time in a long time, she was hearing herself. One gray morning, as the soft rain tapped gently against the window, Margaret opened the old cedar chest tucked in the corner of her bedroom. She hadn't touched it in years. The brass latch creaked softly as she lifted the lid. The familiar scent of cedar filled the air, wrapping around her like an old memory. Inside were pieces of her life, carefully folded linens, family photos, old birthday cards, and small trinkets that once decorated her home. Margaret ran her fingers over each item, feeling the weight of time pressing softly against her fingertips. Near the bottom, she found a worn envelope with her name written on it in careful, steady handwriting. She knew that handwriting. It was Frank's, her late husband. Her breath caught in her chest as she carefully opened it. The paper was slightly yellowed, but the words were clear. "My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. I hope you never have to feel alone. But I know how strong you are. You've given your whole life to our family. You built this life with your hands and your heart. Everything we have is because of you. If they ever forget that, you don't have, too. You hold more power than you know. The house, the savings, the life insurance, it's all in your name. You protected us. Now protect yourself. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small. You are the strongest woman I've ever known. All. My love, forever." Frank tears filled Margaret's eyes, but they didn't fall. Instead, she pressed her hand gently over the letter, as if touching Frank one last time. His words filled the quiet room, giving her something she hadn't felt in months. Strength. She wiped her eyes and sat back, letting the words settle deep inside her. She had given everything to her family, and now they had turned away. But Frank had seen her. He had always seen her. Margaret carefully placed the letter back into the envelope and stood up. She walked to the small desk in the corner and pulled out a drawer that held her important papers. There, Neatly filed were the documents she had almost forgotten: the house deed with her name on it, her savings account statements, her will. For so long she thought of herself as someone dependent, someone at the mercy of her children's attention, waiting for invitations, hoping for scraps of love. But looking at these papers, she saw the truth. She had built this life. She had earned every brick, every dollar, every moment of peace she still held. They hadn't given her a thing. She was never a burden. She was the foundation. Her phone buzzed softly. It was Claire, an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. Claire had been a quiet, steady presence back when their children were small. She had moved away after her husband passed, but somehow she always found a way to check in. Margaret answered, her voice steady. "Hello, Claire." "Oh, Margaret, I've been thinking about you. How are you holding up?" Claire's voice was warm and familiar. Margaret smiled softly. "I'm better than I was." They spoke for a long time, sharing small stories, soft laughter, and gentle words that Margaret hadn't heard in so long. No judgment, no sharp remarks, just kindness. When the call ended, Margaret sat quietly for a moment, holding the phone in her hands. The room no longer felt so cold. She stood, gathered her papers, and placed them neatly into a folder. Then she opened the curtains wide, letting the soft daylight pour in. Her world had grown small, but it wasn't empty. She still had herself. She still had her strength. And now she had something else, too, a spark. It glowed quietly inside her, small but steady, like a match lit in the dark. Margaret took a deep breath. She wasn't finished. Not yet. Margaret stepped into the law office on a bright, cool morning. The receptionist looked up with a polite smile. "Good morning, ma'am. Do you have an appointment?" "Yes," Margaret said softly. "With Mr. Reynolds." A few minutes later, she sat across from a man in a neat gray suit. Mr. Reynolds had handled Frank's estate years ago. His face showed polite surprise as he reviewed her file. "Well, Mrs. Wilson," he said kindly, "it's been a long time. What can I help you with today?" Margaret placed her folder on the desk. Her voice was calm. "I need to make some changes." Mr. Reynolds adjusted his glasses and opened the folder, scanning the documents she brought. He nodded slowly. "I see. You still own your house outright. You have sizable savings. Everything is in your name, as your husband arranged. That's very good." Margaret's eyes stayed steady. "I want to update my will, remove certain people, add my friend Claire as my beneficiary and executor." He paused, glancing at her. "You're certain?" "Yes." He nodded again and made notes. "Anything else?" "I want to place my accounts into protected trusts. I want my assets secure, untouchable." "That can be done," Mr. Reynolds said. "Once these changes are complete, no one will be able to claim anything without your direct consent." Margaret breathed deeply. "Good." They went through each document carefully. Margaret signed each page with steady hands. The pen glided smoothly across the paper. No hesitation. No doubt, when they finished, Mr. Reynolds smiled. "You're very thorough, very wise." "I've spent a long time letting others handle everything," she said softly. "That time is over." She left the office with a quiet sense of calm. She hadn't needed to argue. She hadn't needed to shout. The power came from quiet, steady steps. Her next stop was the bank. The manager greeted her kindly, walking her through each step as she moved her money into secured accounts. She added Claire as her backup contact, removing Susan and David entirely. The paperwork was long, but Margaret never rushed. She read every word. She signed every page. By the end of the day, everything was done. Her home, her savings, her future, it all belonged fully to her, protected and safe. That evening, back at her small kitchen table, Margaret pulled out her notebook. She opened a fresh page and began writing, not to Susan, not to David, to herself. She wrote down everything she had done, each change, each document filed. She listed every account, every trust, every decision. She included names, dates, and contact information. It was not a letter of anger. It was a record of strength, a map of her choices, a reminder that she had taken control of her life again. She slipped the notebook into the cedar chest beside Frank's letter. Her hand rested for a moment on the lid. She whispered softly, "I did it, Frank." The apartment was still quiet, but the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to beg for respect. Margaret had written a new ending for herself, and none of them even knew yet. The newspaper arrived one morning, folded neatly on her doorstep. Margaret carried it inside, her hands calm and steady. She placed it on the table, poured herself a cup of tea, and slowly unfolded the front page. There it was. Local woman donates home to help women in crisis. Below the headline was a photo of her house, the one she had poured years of work and love into. The article explained how Margaret Wilson, a lifelong resident, had donated her fully paid home to a women's shelter that would serve mothers and children in need. The reporter wrote about her years of quiet service, her resilience, her kindness. It spoke of how she wanted the house to become a safe place for women who had no one to turn to, just as she once felt. Margaret read the article slowly, breathing deeply after every line. She had chosen this herself, quietly, carefully, fully. The house glowed with warm lights as laughter spilled out through the open door. Margaret stood just outside, her hands gripping the edges of her coat. The cool air nipped at her skin. She wasn't invited this year, not officially. But this was still her family. She took a slow breath and stepped inside. The living room was filled with people, her son, David, his wife, their friends, and children. The smell of roasted turkey and sweet potatoes hung heavy in the air. The dining table sparkled with crystal glasses and fine plates. As Margaret moved toward the group, her eyes fell on her grandchildren. They had grown taller since she last saw them. Her heart ached at how much she had missed. She smiled softly and opened her arms. "Hi, sweethearts," she said gently. The children looked up, their faces blank. One of them whispered to the other, "Who is that?" Margaret froze. The words hit her like a slap. Their mother, Susan, stepped in quickly, placing a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Kids, go help your father in the kitchen." The children scurried away without another glance. Susan turned to Margaret, her voice low but sharp. "Mom, you really should have called first." Margaret's throat tightened. I just wanted to see everyone. It's Thanksgiving." Susan's eyes flicked toward the guests, her smile forced. "We have a full house tonight. It's not a good time." Margaret stood there, feeling the weight of every word. She glanced around. Strangers filled the seats where she once sat. People she didn't know laughed and toasted while she stood alone, unnoticed. David walked by carrying a platter. He barely looked at her. "Hey, Mom. Didn't expect you." His voice was flat, like she was a neighbor stopping by, not his mother. Her chest tightened. She opened her mouth, searching for words, but none came. Instead, she simply nodded, trying to hold her tears back. Susan leaned in, lowering her voice even more. "I don't want to make a scene. Maybe it's best if you head home. We'll call you later this week, okay?" Margaret looked into her daughter's eyes, searching for even a flicker of warmth. But there was none, only cold distance. She turned slowly, her legs heavy, and walked toward the door. Behind her, the room buzzed with laughter again, as if she had never been there at all. Outside, the cold air bit harder. She stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of celebration. The family she raised, the grandchildren she once rocked to sleep, now barely recognized her. Her heart ached. How had it come to this? She pulled her coat tighter and walked into the darkness, the door closing softly behind her. Margaret sat in her small apartment later that night, staring at the photo on her side table. It was an old picture of David and Susan holding their newborn daughter, with Margaret standing proudly beside them. She ran her fingers along the frame, lost in the soft hum of memories. She remembered how it all started. David was just a boy when his father left. Margaret raised him on her own. She worked long shifts at the diner, standing on her feet for hours, always smiling at customers even when her back ached and her legs throbbed. She took sewing jobs at night, mending clothes for neighbors to make a little extra. She made sure David never felt the emptiness she carried. Every school project was finished with care, every scraped knee kissed and bandaged. She was there for every parent-teacher meeting, every baseball game, every bedtime story. When he was sick, she stayed up all night, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, whispering that everything would be okay. When David married Susan, Margaret opened her arms wide. She helped plan the wedding, sewed the flower girl's dress by hand, and stood proudly as they exchanged vows. She had dreamed of this, a family growing, a home filled with laughter. When the grandkids arrived, Margaret became their second mother. She babysat them while Susan worked, rocking them to sleep, reading their favorite books over and over. She cooked their meals, folded tiny clothes, and sang lullabies late into the night. Even when her body grew older and slower, she never said no. She drove them to school, packed their lunches, and sat in the front row at every recital and school. Play, clapping the loudest. Holidays were her favorite. She cooked for days, filling the house with the rich smells of roasting turkey, fresh pies, and warm bread. She polished the good dishes and laid out the family table, smiling as everyone gathered. Her heart was full in those moments. She never asked for thanks. She never needed grand gestures. Their smiles were enough. Their laughter was her reward. But as the years passed, things changed. The visits grew shorter. The phone calls less frequent. The invitations stopped coming. She told herself they were busy, that life pulled them in many directions. Even when she moved to her small apartment, she didn't complain. She told herself it was temporary, that family always found a way back to each other. But now, standing uninvited at their Thanksgiving table, hearing her own grandchildren not recognize her, she couldn't deny it anymore. The love she poured into them had faded from their memories. The sacrifices she made were invisible now, like they had never happened at all. She wiped a tear from her cheek and whispered softly into the quiet room, "I was always there." And she had been. Every moment, every milestone, every little thing they needed, she was there. But now, she was alone. The next weekend, Susan called unexpectedly. "We're having a small dinner tomorrow," she said. "You can come if you want. Just something casual." Margaret's heart lifted, even if only slightly. She chose her nicest blouse and fixed her hair carefully. She arrived early, carrying her famous apple pie, hoping to feel part of the family again. The house was full of voices and movement. Laughter came from the living room where the guests gathered. She stepped inside quietly, placing her pie on the kitchen counter. No one greeted her. No one even seemed to notice she was there. The grandkids brushed past her on their way to the backyard. One of them glanced at her, confused for a moment, then whispered loudly, "Who is she again?" Margaret's stomach twisted. She opened her mouth but couldn't bring herself to correct them. From the kitchen she heard Susan and David talking in the next room, their voices low but clear enough. "I don't know why she still comes," Susan said with a sharp tone. "She barely remembers anyone. She just sits there." David chuckled. "Yeah, I know. She acts like she's part of everything, but honestly, it's like having another child around. We have to watch what we say, keep checking on her." Susan sighed. It's exhausting, David. She always brings that same pie, like it matters. I mean, she doesn't even cook for us anymore. She just shows up. Margaret's ears rang as the words landed, each one cutting deeper. She felt frozen, standing behind the wall, hidden like a shadow in her own family's home. David lowered his voice. Honestly, she's a burden now. I know that sounds awful, but it's true. We're busy. We have our own lives. Susan didn't argue. She simply said, "We'll figure something out after the holidays." Margaret gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, her knuckles white. Her breath came slow and shaky. The pie she had baked with such care sat untouched beside her, its warm scent filling the cold air around her. The living room burst with laughter as one of the guests told a joke. No one introduced Margaret to the new people who arrived. Historia stood in the corner, invisible. One woman glanced at her and asked Susan quietly, "Is that your aunt?" Susan smiled politely. "Oh no, that's my mother. She's here sometimes." The woman nodded and turned away without a second thought. Margaret looked around the room, the family photos on the walls, the decorations she had once helped hang during holidays, the home she had once filled with love and care. Now she was a ghost inside it. Her heart pounded, but she said nothing. She didn't want to cry in front of them. Not here. She stood silently, her back straight, swallowing the pain like she had done so many times before. The words replayed in her mind. Burden, exhausting, figure something out. She had spent her life giving, loving, sacrificing. And now, this is how they saw her. She didn't speak up, not yet, but inside her, something shifted. The hurt didn't fade, but something else began to grow beside it. Not anger, not yet, strength. The days after the dinner slipped by in slow silence. No calls came, no texts. The house stayed still. Margaret sat by the window, watching the winter wind bend the bare trees. The sky was pale gray, and the streets were empty. She checked her phone often, hoping for a message from Susan or David. Just a simple, "How are you, Mom?" would have meant everything. But the screen stayed blank. When she couldn't stand the quiet, she sent a message herself. "Hope you're doing well. Miss you." The tiny check mark appeared right away. Read. But no reply came. She waited, thinking maybe they were busy. Hours passed, then a full day. Nothing. She sent another message a few days later. "Let me know if the kids want to visit sometime. I can bake cookies." Again, read. Again, silence. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from her. The chair that once held giggling grandchildren, eating warm cookies and telling her about their day. Now it sat untouched, like a forgotten place in her shrinking world. Across town, Susan sat at her kitchen table, staring at the same article. Her face was pale. David paced behind her, reading the headline over her shoulder, his voice sharp. "She can't do this. This was supposed to be our inheritance." Susan shook her head slowly, her voice thin. "She already did it, David. We didn't even know." David threw his hands up. "Why would she give it away? We're her family." Susan couldn't answer. Deep inside, part of her knew. A week later, they sat in the lawyer's office, their faces tense. Mr. Reynolds calmly read from Margaret's updated will, his voice steady and professional. "All assets, savings, and properties have been assigned to various charities and trusts, including the newly formed Margaret Wilson Foundation, supporting women and children in crisis. The foundation will be overseen by her dear friend, Claire Roberts." Susan's mouth tightened. "There must be something for us," she whispered, barely able to breathe. Mr. Reynolds glanced at the paper and continued. "Margaret Wilson left no inheritance to her son, David Wilson, or her daughter-in-law, Susan Wilson, stating that they had already chosen to live without her." Silence filled the room. David stood up abruptly. "This isn't right. She was manipulated." Mr. Reynolds folded the papers calmly. Mrs. Wilson acted fully within her rights. She made these choices freely and with great care. Susan's hands shook in her lap. She couldn't speak. The words from that dinner, from those careless conversations, echoed now. Burden, exhausting, background noise. They had pushed her aside, ignored her, forgotten her. And now they were forgotten. Back. At her apartment, Margaret sat peacefully by the window. She watched a small group of women tour her old house, the new shelter staff preparing rooms for women who would soon arrive with children, looking for safety. Claire sat beside her, smiling. "You've done something beautiful, Margaret." Margaret nodded gently. "It feels right." Claire placed her hand on Margaret's. "They never saw your worth, but now so many others will." Margaret smiled softly. "I didn't do it to hurt them. I did it to finally take care of myself and others who need it." The setting sun filled the room with warm light. The pain that once weighed on her chest had lifted. The anger was gone. All that remained was peace. They had taken her for granted. But in the end, she had left them something they would never forget, and she had done it with grace. The calls started the very next morning. Her phone lit up again and again. Susan, David, unknown numbers she didn't recognize. The buzzing filled the apartment, but Margaret didn't move. She sat by the window, sipping her tea, watching the soft breeze sway the trees outside. The voicemails stacked up quickly. First came Susan's voice, shaky and rushed. "Mom, please, we need to talk. We didn't mean for things to get so distant. I miss you." Then David, his voice sharper but still desperate. "Mom, you blindsided us. You should have told us what you were planning. We're family. We could have worked this out. Please call back." More messages followed, some apologetic, some angry, some trying to sound casual, like nothing had happened. Margaret let each one play, but she never reached for the phone. She listened quietly, letting the words pass through her like distant waves. They weren't really talking to her. They were talking to their own guilt, to the sudden fear of loss they never felt when she stood quietly in their lives. As days passed, the messages shifted. "We're sorry. We didn't realize how you felt. We were busy. Life got in the way. Don't shut us out. Let's fix this, please." But Margaret had no desire to fix what had long been broken. She had reached for them for years. She had waited, begged silently for inclusion, for warmth, for simple recognition. Now she was done waiting. Claire came by most afternoons, bringing fresh bread from the market or small gifts for the apartment. They sat on the porch together, sharing quiet conversations and easy smiles. One afternoon, as Claire poured them both a fresh cup of tea, Margaret's phone buzzed again on the table. Susan's name flashed across the screen. Claire glanced at it, then looked to Margaret. "You want me to turn it off?" Margaret smiled softly. "No need. Let it ring." The phone vibrated for a few more seconds before falling silent. They sipped their tea as the birds chirped in the garden below. The sun was warm on their faces. Margaret no longer needed their voices. She no longer craved their approval or feared their silence. She had carried the weight of their distance for too many years. Now, that weight was gone. Her apartment was small, but it was hers. Her world had grown quieter, but it was full in ways it never had been before. The women at the shelter sent her letters, sharing their gratitude for her gift. The foundation grew stronger under Claire's care. Margaret read every note, each one a quiet reminder that her life had value far beyond the family that once ignored her. The love she had given her children wasn't wasted. She knew that. But she also knew love couldn't be forced where it was, no longer welcomed. Her phone buzzed less as the weeks passed. The apologies turned into silence. The silence no longer frightened her. Margaret had stopped waiting to be chosen. She was already home. Margaret stood in the doorway of her old house, now filled with soft voices and warm light. The shelter had fully opened last month. The rooms that once sat cold and empty were alive again. She walked slowly through the hallway, her steps steady. She paused to watch a young mother rock her baby gently in the living room, whispering soft words of comfort. In the kitchen, another woman stirred a pot of soup, humming quietly to herself. Laughter floated from upstairs where children played, their voices bright and full of life. Margaret smiled softly. This house was once her battlefield, where she fought to be seen, to belong, to matter. Now it was a place of safety, of healing. Just as she had always tried to make it, the pictures of her family were gone from the walls, but in their place hung paintings made by the children living there now. Bright colors, small handprints, simple words of hope. She walked into what used to be her dining room. The large table was still there, but instead of fancy dishes and tense family dinners, it now held art supplies, storybooks, and board games. The chairs were filled with women and children talking softly, sharing quiet moments of peace. Margaret's eyes moved across the space. She could still see faint echoes of holidays past, of birthdays and late-night conversations, of the years she poured her heart into making this house a home. For a long time, she believed she had failed, that she had loved too much, held too tightly, given too freely, but now she saw the truth. She had not been the burden. She had been the shelter. She was the one who kept the home warm, who held everyone up, who gave them roots to stand on. They had forgotten, but she hadn't. Margaret caught her reflection in a window pane as the afternoon sun glowed behind her. The face looking back at her was older, softer, but strong. The lines around her eyes told the story of a life lived fully. The silver in her hair shimmered like a quiet crown. For years, she had looked in mirrors and wondered if she had become small, if she had lost her place, her worth. But now she knew. She had never lost anything. The problem had never been her. They had chosen distance. They had chosen forgetfulness. She had chosen love. And now she was choosing herself, without guilt, without sorrow. Claire appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of tea. "It feels different now, doesn't it?" she said softly. Margaret accepted the cup and nodded. "It does. It feels right." "You made it into something beautiful," Claire said. "Something that matters." Margaret looked around the room again, breathing in the quiet joy that filled the space. "I didn't know I could feel this at peace." Claire smiled. "You deserve it." Margaret sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. She had given everything. She had been forgotten. But she had found her way back, not through anger or bitterness, but through quiet strength. This house had always been hers, not because of ownership papers, but because of what she poured into it. Now, it was full again, full of life, full of purpose, and so was she. The evening light poured gently through the windows as Margaret moved through her small apartment. The air smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread, filling the room with warmth. She set the table carefully, a mise, single plate, polished silverware, a folded napkin. In the center, she lit a small candle. The soft flame flickered, casting a golden glow across the table. She looked around the room. It was quiet, but not hollow. The silence felt calm, steady, full. No voices called her name. No one brushed past her like she didn't exist. This quiet belonged to her. Margaret sat down, her back straight, her hands gentle as she reached for her fork. She took her first bite slowly, savoring the flavors. She had cooked this meal for herself, exactly how she liked it. The candle's flame danced lightly in front of her, its gentle light reflected in her eyes as she smiled softly. For so many years, she had stood on the edges of crowded rooms, waiting to be seen, waiting to be invited to sit, waiting to feel like she belonged. She had poured herself into her family, offering every piece of her love without question. She had stood in kitchens for hours, carried children on her hip, and listened patiently to stories, worries, and complaints. She had always made room for others, and when they no longer needed her, they had turned away. But now there was no waiting, no hoping for a place at someone else's table, no silent ache sitting behind forced smiles. This table was hers. Margaret lifted her glass, filled with cool water, and whispered softly to the quiet air, "To me." She took a slow sip, feeling the calm spread through her like warm sunlight. She glanced toward the small corner where her cedar chest sat, holding Frank's letter and the careful records of her choices. She thought of him then, his quiet strength, his belief in her, his gentle words telling her she had always been the heart of everything. She carried that strength now, fully. The phone sat silent on the counter. No calls, no apologies. But she no longer needed either. She had learned how to hold herself up. Her life was not smaller now. It was clearer. As she continued her meal, the soft hum of evening settled around her. The world outside dimmed, but inside her heart glowed steady and strong. For so long, she had feared being alone. Now she understood. Alone wasn't empty. Alone was free. This time she ate at her table, alone and free.